Hello everyone, and welcome to the second episode of 5 Minutes of tlou. My name is TheiPadCat, and today I thought we'd be discussing the military in The Last of Us universe, and more specifically answer the question to whether or not they will return in part 2. My short answer to this is that it's possible that we see them, but it's not a certainty. If you're not satisfied with that answer, here are 4 possible ways we could see them, and 2 reasons we won't. Starting with the possible ways we could encounter the military in part 2. We could encounter them through a flashback, maybe through the eyes of Joel or Ellie's supposed mom. The reason why this alternative is the most likely way we'll see the military in part 2 is because very few quarantine zones remain operational by the time of part 1. We actually only have concrete evidence for one still being operational, which is Boston. And there's no way of telling if there'll be even fewer 5 years later when part 2 takes place. Another way we could see them is that there is a change of their goals from what they were at the time of part 1. The only vision or goal, or whatever you want to call it, the military had in part 1, that we know of, was to hold on to the remaining zones. But through a note we get to know that they were previously conducting rescue operations to get survivors to safety, but has ceased to do so. What if they began doing this again in part 2? One reason they might do this is that the Fireflies, by the time of part 2, will probably be a significantly lesser threat, as Joel practically decimated them at the end of part 1. We could also encounter an operational quarantine zone we didn't know about. This is also a reasonable possibility since Naughty Dog practically hasn't specified at all where all the QCs are situated, which gives them a lot of creative freedom in that area of the tlou universe in part 2. Yet another, although very unlikely way we'll get to see the military come back is through a return to Boston. The only way I could really see this happening is through a flashback. All promotional material for part 2 thus far has hinted at the game taking place on the West Coast. Sure, it isn't impossible that we travel from one side of the country to the other. I mean, that's literally what happened in part 1. But I doubt we'll get to see any previous locations in part 2, except for Tommy's town. But more on that in a moment. Now, let's move on to the reasons why we wouldn't get to see the military in part 2. Assuming Boston is the only one or one of the very few zones still operating, and considering the fact that the military has no intention of patrolling or moving far distances from their bases, as revealed by the note mentioned earlier, and that the game most likely takes place on the West Coast, we probably won't get to see them. Another reason we possibly won't see them is that the man, the myth, the legend himself, Neil Druckmann, doesn't want to repeat himself in part 2. He mentioned this at the PSX 2016 conference.
It's different for a sequel than the original, because the original you don't have a lot to draw from, it's all kind of fresh ideas. And with the sequel, you could easily fall into the trap of like, okay, the first one was great, and you start operating out of fear of like, okay, we need the giraffe moment, we need the winter sequence, we need the guy that's going to be like David. And I've definitely felt that, like, I don't know if these scenes are going to be as good as that, but you kind of have to ignore all that and say, okay, what is this story? What are the moments for this story? Where are the characters now? They're very different than the characters they were in the first game, and just honor that. Like, there might not be a giraffe sequence, there might not be a character like David, but there will be different moments, and hopefully they resonate as much as the ones in the first game.
This is why I think Naughty Dog might consider including the military in part 2 a risk of repeating themselves. This is also why I said I don't think we'll get to see any of the previous locations a moment ago. Even though Neil is talking about characters here, I think it's reasonable to assume that it also applies to locations. Out of all the alternatives, both positive and negative, in regards to whether we'll see the military or not, what I just mentioned about Neil and this entire repeating himself thing, I think this is the most likely alternative, that we don't get to see them because The Last of Us 2 or part 2 is a new game, it's a new experience, it's not supposed to be like the first one. But who knows? That's just what I think. What do you think? Do you have any theories of your own? Post them in the comments down below and let's discuss it. And until next time, Have a good day.